Hey folks, Eder from Brain Pulp TV, and it is finally time. The newest expansion from Magic the Gathering, Core Set 2020, has finally arrived. And as with all the new sets that have come out over the past couple years, there are some new Planeswalker decks being released along with it. And in this video, I'm going to be opening up and giving you my overview for the Chandra Flames Fury deck. However, before I get into talking about Planeswalker decks, both in general and specifically the one I'll be opening up in this video, I just wanted to mention that if you've seen any of the previous Core Set 2020 Planeswalker deck overview videos already, this introduction, and to a certain extent the opening as well, will cover a lot of the same ground you've already seen. So to help you navigate your way to whatever parts you're most interested in, there are currently some time codes being displayed on the sideboard graphic, which shows you what's happening in the video and where, in case you'd like to skip past something you've already seen. I'll also be adding the same time codes to a pinned comment to make this even easier, especially if you're watching this on your computer. However, for those of you who are new to these overview videos or Planeswalker decks as a whole, allow me to kick things off by talking a bit about what these decks are and some of the things you can typically expect to find in them. Along with that, I will also be making mention of any notable exceptions that have popped up either with these Core Set 2020 decks or decks that have come out in the past. Oh, and if this is currently the only Core Set 2020 Planeswalker deck video on the site and you're wondering why I'm talking about other videos, just so you know, there will be other videos coming out very soon, probably a day or two apart, but all 5 of the Core Set 2020 Planeswalker decks will have an overview video on the channel soon. Okay, so now that we have that all out of the way, what are Planeswalker decks, you may ask? Planeswalker decks are 60-card standard legal decks that will either contain only cards from the current expansion they're being released with, or if they're being released along with an expansion that's part of a multi-set block, they will sometimes contain cards from both the newest expansion as well as some of the cards from any of the other sets found within that block. For example, while the Kaladesh Planeswalker decks contained only cards from Kaladesh, the Aether Revolt decks contained cards from both Kaladesh and Aether Revolt, since they were both part of a block set. The decks are usually released in pairs, each sold separately mind you, with the exception of the 2019 and 2020 Core Set decks, where 5 new decks accompanied those sets instead. They're also almost always multicolored decks, most often consisting of 2 colors each. Once again though, with the exception of the aforementioned core sets, where Wizards made all the decks monocolored, each one representing a different color on the color wheel. All Planeswalker decks also feature a, surprise surprise, Planeswalker which is exclusive to that deck, which means you will not be able to find that specific Planeswalker in regular packs of Magic the Gathering. This Planeswalker is, more often than not, tailor-made to complement whatever overarching theme or playstyle that particular deck is meant to have. The downside though is that they're rather costly when it comes to how much mana you'll need to spend to get them into play, which I'm pretty sure Wizard does by design to guarantee that there's no chance any of these cards will ever be seen as overpowered. 2 final notes on these Planeswalkers. First, unlike with the vast majority of Planeswalkers that you'll find in regular packs of Magic, the Planeswalker deck Planeswalker's ultimate ability, which is the nickname given to a final and most powerful ability you'll see listed on a Planeswalker, will never produce a static emblem that will persist for the rest of the game. Once again, like with the casting cost of this cards, I'm sort of speculating that the reason behind this is because they don't want to somehow make them overpowered, but to be honest, I'm not entirely certain why R&D has made this particular choice. And finally, Planeswalker deck Planeswalkers are always printed with a foil finish, or as Wizards calls it, premium finish. This is purely a cosmetic feature of the card and in no way affects the gameplay, but since I know a lot of newer players buy these decks, I still thought it was worth pointing out. So just in case anyone out there might think that all the cards in the deck will be as shiny as the one they see on the front of the box, they won't. Now, aside from the featured Planeswalker, every Planeswalker deck also contains multiple copies of 3 other cards that will be exclusive to the deck and therefore not available in booster packs. These exclusive cards have always taken the form of 4 copies of a common card, 3 copies of an uncommon card, and 2 copies of a rare card. The only exception to this so far has been the Sorin Planeswalker deck from Core Set 2020, which for some unknown reason they decided to include 4 different exclusive cards with it instead of 3. However, we'll talk more about that when we get around to doing the actual overview for that deck. For now though, let's set aside the exception and talk more about the general rules when it comes to these exclusive cards. The rare cards are almost always a tutor card that allows you to search your deck and or graveyard specifically for that deck's Planeswalker and put it into your hand. And I do mean specifically, as it only targets the exact same Planeswalker from that deck, which prevents this from being a useful tutor for other Planeswalkers, even if they both share a name, like Chandra for example. The only time that this hasn't been the case with the tutor cards was in Core Set 2019, where instead they added cards that allowed the players to look at the top 5 cards of the library, reveal one that matched a specific color or type specified by the card, and then add that card to their hand. I was actually quite curious if this is something they were planning to do with all future core set Planeswalker decks, but it seems like that won't be the case since 2020 has indeed stuck with the classic version of the tutor cards. Anyway, these cards can take the form of an instant, sorcery, artifact, or even creature spell that has the tutor ability tacked onto it for good measure. This often allows them to fulfill a more useful role in the game than simply finding your Planeswalker, which is important as they almost always cost just one less mana than your Planeswalker does, so it's often the only spell you'll be able to cast that turn. And it would definitely be a shame to take an entire turn off with no added benefit just to find a card that you can't play until the following turn, even if it is one as powerful as your Planeswalker. Oh, and a quick side note for those of you wondering why cards like this are often referred to as tutor cards, it's because way back in the beginning of Magic, there was a card named Demonic Tutor, which was the first of its kind to allow players to search their decks and add any card from it to their hand. So whenever new cards now pop up that do something very similar to one of the classic cards in the past that did it first, it's often given the label of that card. In this case, tutor cards because of Demonic Tutor. So there you go, folks. I hope you enjoyed that little trip down Magic's memory lane. But let's get back to the exclusive cards found in these decks. Now, the uncommon and common ones are typically less impressive than your tutor card, but often at least one of them gains some sort of benefit from having your Planeswalker or another Planeswalker with the same base name, like, once again, Chandra, for example, on the battlefield. However, for some reason, they've gone ahead and done away with adding this Planeswalker buff style card for most of the 2020 decks, instead only including one in the Mu Yanling and Vivian decks. I have no idea why this choice was made seemingly out of the blue, but at the end of the day, it's not really that big of a deal, because while getting a buff from your Planeswalker is nice, it's not something that comes into play enough to really sway a game one way or the other. After all, these exclusive cards are really just a small part of a much larger deck. So that's why it's time now to widen the focus from just the exclusive cards in the deck and start talking about Planeswalker decks as a whole. So one thing to note with these types of decks, which I briefly touched upon at the beginning of the video when I was first talking about the Planeswalkers, is that more often than not, these decks will have some sort of overarching theme or playstyle built into them, which are meant to show off the strengths of certain colors on the mana wheel and or gameplay mechanics that are found within the set they're being released alongside. For example, the mono blue Mu Yanling deck is all about evading your opponent's blockers through the use of flyers, surprising them with creatures you can flash in at the last moment, and slowing them down with bounce and tap abilities, all of which is very blue in nature. While the mono green Vivian deck, on the other hand, relies more on simply crashing into your opponent's defenses and forcing damage through with larger creatures that have trample, all the while pumping them up even further with support spells. And that's about as classic green as you can get in Magic. Now, one final note about these decks before we move on to the opening, they are very much geared towards newer or more casual players, and while their power levels do vary a bit from deck to deck, none of them are what you would really consider competitive within the current standard environment. However, after doing gameplay videos with every single Planeswalker deck ever created, I can tell you with absolute certainty that more often than not, if you're playing them against other Planeswalker decks, regardless of what set they were released with, they can still make for a really fun match between friends. That said, in the future parts of this video, specifically during the overview and when I give my closing thoughts on the deck, if I ever refer to something as being strong or powerful, I'm very much doing so while looking through the lens of a Planeswalker deck. In other words, I hold these decks to a different standard than I would a Challenger deck or whatever might currently be taking the competitive world of Standard by storm right now. And that's pretty much it when it comes to the ins and outs of your typical Planeswalker deck. Now it's time to move on and open this sucker up so I can show you exactly what you can expect to find inside one of these boxes. Okay, so opening the box up, first and foremost, you see the nice foil Planeswalker that is, once again, exclusive to this deck. Now, I'm going to be talking about this card more in depth when I do the overview, so we're going to set the card aside for now and get to the other contents of this box. So here we have the nice cardboard deck box for the deck. Now, on the front of the box, there's actually different artwork than there is on the Planeswalker. They always seem to do this, not sure why, but I kind of enjoy it because it's good artwork usually on both of them, so always nice to double up on that. On the side of the box, there is the name of the Planeswalker, which has been the same with all of these deck boxes as far as I remember. There is the Planeswalker symbol on the other side of this box as well too. One last thing to note about the box is it does fit sleeved cards. So if you're using standard size sleeves, like I use Dragon Shield sleeves pretty much exclusively, if you're using those types of sleeves, you can get the entire deck sleeved up and you can store it in this box with no problem whatsoever. Just don't try to squeeze any more cards into it than that. Now, if you open up the box, you will find there is some additional contents inside other than the deck. First, though, there is the deck nicely sealed up in plastic. This contains the entire 60 card deck with the exception of the Planeswalker, which obviously was in the front display. There are also a few extra cards on the back here. I'll go over those near the end of the opening because some of them do have some important information and useful things on them that I do want to talk about. However, setting this aside for now, you will see that we also have one booster pack of Core Set 2020. Now, typically with Planeswalker decks, you're going to get 2 booster packs. With the core sets, maybe because they release 5 of them at a time, there is only 1 booster pack included. One thing to note, if you're at a store, a lot of the times, for some reason, they will charge you the same amount for one of these Planeswalker decks, even though they only have 1 booster pack, as they would for any of the other Planeswalker decks that have 2 booster packs. Not really sure what the justification of that is, but it's something to look out for. So if you've got some budget in mind, you may want to take a look at where you're buying and what they're charging versus what they charge for a normal Planeswalker deck and, plan accordingly. Also included with the deck is this little foldout which talks about the Planeswalker inside. It gives a little bit of history, also talks about some of the various mechanics you may find within the deck, as well as a brief description as to how you might want to play it. Then on the other side of the foldout, there is a description as to what Planeswalkers are, as well as some of the rules that govern these types of cards. This could actually be quite useful for new players. I know when I first came back to Magic after a long absence, there were no Planeswalkers when I used to play Magic. Came back and Planeswalkers were a fairly common thing, maybe not common thing, but they would pop up from time to time. And I remember looking at the card having absolutely no idea how to play it. So this could be especially useful, once again, for new players when they're trying to learn the ropes as to how to play a Planeswalker. Okay, so now that we've talked all about these little bits and bobs that come with the Planeswalker deck, let's crack open the Planeswalker deck itself. But before we get into the actual cards and I give the overview for the deck, let's talk about some of these inserts which were included with this deck, which may be interesting to a lot of you out there. Now, originally, Planeswalker decks and some of the decks that came before it used to have this little sort of foldout which gave you sort of a breakdown of the basic rules of Magic. Now, though, they have these inserts. This particular card, for example, talks about what you can do on your turn. It discusses the beginning, main phase, combat, second main phase, and end phase of a regular turn of Magic. Once again, a very useful little reference for new players, much like how the foldout was for learning how to play Planeswalkers. Speaking of Planeswalkers, the other side of this card talks a bit about the loyalty system when it comes to Planeswalkers, how you can keep track of it, and what happens if your Planeswalker runs out. It's not exactly the most comprehensive bit of information they can give you about Planeswalkers, but it might help you out a little bit. The next insert included with the deck talks about combat damage, also discusses the power and toughness of a creature and what those numbers mean. So once again, not exactly the most comprehensive listing of rules, but it's the basic information that you need to sort of understand combat in general when it comes to Magic. However, if you do need a bit more information when it comes to combat and Magic, the flip side of this card discusses attacking and blocking. Goes over the ins and outs of what you need to do to be able to attack as well as block. Now, even if you're a very, very new player to Magic, you probably already have a handle on this particular aspect of the game, but it doesn't hurt to give you this information just in case. Now, the final insert that comes along with the deck is easily the most important insert that you will have with your deck. This is the deck code that you can enter in on MTG Arena and get yourself this exact Planeswalker deck in digital format. This is something I really wish Wizards would include with all of their standard legal pre-con decks, including things like Challenger decks as well too, which do not come with these particular digital codes. It's just a nice, simple incentive that Wizards can do in order to double up the usefulness if you're actually going and buying a physical product from a store. You can also give this code away to one of your friends. Now keep in mind, you can only use it once, so if you're going to give this away, you're not going to be able to use it for yourself. But let's say you bought a couple of Planeswalker decks, and you want to be able to play this on Magic Arena against one of your friends. It could be a really good way to bring someone towards Magic Arena that has never played the game before. This way, they get a nice little deck which is on par with one of your decks, and you guys can battle it out anytime you want whenever you're online. And that brings us to the end of the extra insert cards you'll find in the deck. Now, it's time to tackle all the playable cards and give you a basic overview of the deck itself. The way I'll be doing this is first I'll be talking a bit about the overall theme of the deck, including both its key elements, as well as any useful gameplay mechanics it might feature that could help lead you to victory. Then I'll go through each card individually and discuss how they may, or possibly in some cases, may not work within the deck. I'll do this first by giving you my thoughts on the Planeswalker, and then the other exclusive cards. After that, I'll go through all the creatures, followed by all the non-creature spells, and I'll do all of that in order of converted mana cost. So, That's the game plan, folks. Now let's get started. The mono-red Chandra Flames Fury deck from Core Set 2020 is about two things: aggression and burn. Every single creature in this deck has some way to do additional damage that goes beyond its base attack power, either in the form of an activated or triggered ability. In fact, some creatures don't even have to connect with direct combat damage to start chipping away at your opponent's life total. On top of that, every single non-creature spell in this deck, except for one, is capable of dealing direct damage to their face, and that includes all three loyalty abilities of your Planeswalker, which is extremely useful considering several of your creatures also benefit anytime you're able to inflict non-combat damage to an opponent. To make matters worse for whoever's sitting across the table from you, you can also turn a lot of that burn towards their creatures, often at instant speed, thus clearing the way for your army to swing in and attack, which is important because you want to be attacking as soon and as often as you can with this deck. Still, even if you do find yourself in a stalemate with no good attacks to be had, you're far from helpless, since cards like Pyroclastic Elemental and Chandra herself are capable of just sitting back and putting your opponent on a clock till they eventually run out of time and or life. Or you could always get lucky and draw into one of your dragons to fly over the battlefield and crush your opponent by air. However, that may not be as easy as it seems, because not only are there only one copy of each of your big bad fire-breathing buddies in your library, but one of the major downsides of this deck is its lack of card draw, which means when your hand starts to look a little empty, you really don't have any way to fill it back up again. So again, you're going to want to turn up the heat as high as you can, as soon as you can, because if the game goes on too long and you don't have any direct damage mana sinks on the battlefield, you may find yourself running out of steam against an opponent who's constantly able to refill their hand and eventually douse your flames. And speaking of flames and bad segues, let's start talking about the individual cards in this deck, beginning with the Planeswalker itself, Chandra Flames Fury. For 4 and 2 red, you get a 4 loyalty Planeswalker. The +1 ability is Chandra deals 2 damage to any target. -2, Chandra deals 4 damage to target creature and 2 damage to that creature's controller. And then the ultimate ability, which is -8, is Chandra deals 10 damage to target player and each creature that player controls. So Chandra's role in this deck is pretty straightforward. She is backup support with burn towards your opponent and their creatures. The +1 ability, being Shock and a Stick, means she can deal 2 damage to your opponent, to their creatures, or if they have one of their Planeswalkers out, to the Planeswalker as well too. This is also one of the cards I mentioned a little earlier in the overview when I talked about something that could break up a stalemate. If you can't swing in and do combat damage, you can have Chandra sit back and just constantly ping your opponent for 2 each and every turn, putting them on a clock. Then of course there's her -2 ability, which does something which all Planeswalkers really need to be able to do, and that's protect themselves. So you get Chandra out on turn 6. Maybe you don't have a great defense put up as far as creatures go. You need to take out one of your opponent's creatures. You can now do that with the -2 ability, because 4 damage typically will deal with a wide range of creatures that may be on the board. And then as an added bonus, you're still chipping away on your opponent, because every time you use this ability, you're still doing 2 damage directly to their face as well. Then there's her flashy ultimate ability. 10 damage to the opponent, 10 damage to each of their creatures. This is definitely going to be a one-sided board wipe. 10 damage is typically enough to wipe out everything that doesn't have indestructible, and then 10 damage to your opponent's face, that is half their starting life total. However, before you get too excited, keep in mind Chandra will have to be on the board for 5 turns before you ever get a chance to actually use this ability, so keep that in mind. Still, if some way, somehow you are able to get this off, it is always a good feeling to be able to ultimate one of your Planeswalkers, even if that means you have to spend all their loyalty and knock them off the board as well too. Alrighty, now let's move on to the other exclusive cards in this deck, starting with the one that will get Chandra from your deck or your graveyard into your hand, and that's Chandra's Flame Wave. For 3 and 2 red, you get a sorcery. Chandra's Flame Wave deals 2 damage to target player and each creature that player controls. Search your library and or graveyard for a card named Chandra Flames Fury, reveal it, put it into your hand. If you searched your library this way, shuffle it. So this is like a mini version of Chandra's ultimate ability, and it also gives you the added effect of being able to find Chandra and have it put in your hand. Now it costs 5, Chandra costs 6, so there's a good chance if you cast this, you can cast Chandra the very next turn, even if you're only at 5 mana when you do cast this card. Granted, that means that you'll need to have at least one other mountain in your hand at that time, but that's not outside the realm of possibility. Now, as I just said, this is sort of a mini version of Chandra's ultimate ability, but don't discount it because it can still be incredibly powerful. 2 damage to your opponent's face, not necessarily that big of a deal, but 2 damage to each of their creatures, and this is one-sided. It's not all the creatures on the board, it's just your opponent's creatures, can actually act as a mini board wipe. So yes, if this spell goes off at the right time, it can be devastating. Trust me, I'm talking from experience. If you're playing this deck against the Ajani deck, for example, which has a lot of creatures with low toughness, this will wipe your opponent's board. The other way you can do this is you can wait to your second main phase, after combat. Maybe you've tacked on a bit of extra damage to some of your opponent's creatures where they thought they were getting favorable blocks. This comes out, it does the additional 2 points of damage it needs to wipe out those creatures as well too. And one final note on this card, it also has the distinction in Core Set 2020 of being the only Planeswalker deck tutor card which is not a creature. Now, I'm not sure why they went with creatures for all the other tutor cards, but I do like the fact that they stuck to a burn style spell for Chandra's deck, because it's very much on flavor and on theme with this deck. Next up, we have the common exclusive card for this deck. It is Wildfire Elemental. For 2 and 2 red, you get a 3/3 Elemental with whenever an opponent is dealt non-combat damage, creatures you control get +1/+0 until the end of turn. Now, a 3/3 for 4 isn't necessarily the best in the world. It's not the worst either, and the extra ability this creature has makes it on theme with the rest of the deck. Because as I said before, the creatures in this deck all have some way of dealing more damage than their base power would normally let them. And in the case of Wildfire Elemental, it can actually help your other creatures on the board as well too. Because the way it's worded is, creatures you control get +1/+0 until the end of turn. Not other creatures, not just himself, all creatures. So that includes him and all the other creatures on the board. And all you have to do is deal non-combat damage to your opponent, which in this deck is laughably easy. So for a common card, it's a nice inclusion and you get 4 copies of it. Moving on to the final and uncommon exclusive card in this deck, we have Pyroclastic Elemental. For 3 and 2 red, you get a 5/4 elemental creature with pay 1, 2 red, it deals 1 damage to target player. So first off, the 5/4 body for 5 is fairly decent. Once again, not the best in the world, but you're not exactly expecting that with an uncommon card. However, its added ability of paying 1 and 2 red to deal 1 damage to target player, this is the other card that I mentioned before, which you can sit back with if your board state isn't necessarily favorable for attacks, and just keep pinging your opponent turn after turn. In fact, given the cost of this card, you can probably sit back and ping your opponent for 2 or 3 points of damage on their end step each turn if you want to. So yes, this is very much a card which can help break up a stalemate and put your opponent on a clock they otherwise wouldn't have been on. And since they give you 3 copies of this in your deck, there is a very good chance you will have it in your hand or on the board when you really need it. Okay, so now it's time to talk about the non-exclusive cards in this deck. And we're going to start off with the creatures in order of converted mana cost. And first up, we have Scorch Spitter. There are 3 copies of this 1/1 for 1 red. It's an elemental lizard, and whenever it attacks, it deals 1 damage to the player or planeswalker it's attacking. So this is a great example of that early aggression you want to have going with this deck. Get this out on turn 1, swing on it with turn 2, you can start doing 2 damage each turn. Also, if this creature ever becomes blocked, it's not that big of a deal. You can throw it away. It will still bleed through 1 point of damage, because the 1 extra point of damage happens when you attack, not when you deal damage, not if you attack and nothing blocks it, simply when it attacks. So you swing in and immediately your opponent takes 1 point of damage. Now, 1 point of damage here and there may not seem like much, but trust me, if you can start whittling away on your opponent, even just 1 extra point of damage at a time early in the game, by the mid game, you are going to be in a really strong position to close it out with either one of your bigger creatures or some extra burn. Moving on now to a 2-drop, we have 4 copies of Pack Mastiff. For 1 and a red, you get a 2/2, which is a bear. For those of you who don't know, any sort of 2/2 creature for 1 and a color is typically referred to as a bear. Really, any sort of 2/2 creature that only costs 2 is a lot of time referred to as a bear, but more specifically, it's a 2/2 for 1 and 1 color. Anyways, that's not really important here. Let's get back to the card. For 1 and 1 red, each creature you control named Pack Mastiff gets +1/+0 until the end of turn. So this is one of those types of cards where if you're going to run it, you definitely want to do like they do here and have you run 4 copies of it, because the more copies you can get on the board, the better it is for you. Now, a lot of cards have this sort of pay some mana and it gets +1/+0 type ability. It's called like a fire breathing ability. But with Pack Mastiff, the great thing about it is if you have multiple copies up, you only have to pay that cost once, and it's going to affect every copy of Pack Mastiff you have on the board. So it saves you a bit of extra mana that you otherwise would have had to waste sinking into each individual creature. So yes, this is yet another great example of some early aggro you can try to get going with this deck. Next up, we have another bear-esque type creature, 3 copies of Ember Hauler. For 2 red, you get a 2/2 goblin, has pay 1, sacrifice it, it deals 2 damage to any target. Now, of course, a 2/2 for 2 isn't anything special. It's not bad, it's pretty much on par with what you expect for 2 mana when it comes to a creature. However, the added ability, and keep in mind as well too, the added ability is not a tap ability. So you can swing in with this creature and then still pay 1 to sacrifice it and deal 2 damage to any target. And the fact that it deals 2 damage to any target is incredible. It's essentially a time delay shock, which you can use anytime as long as you have 1 mana left available to you. So granted, yes, it's not a bomb card in this deck, but it's one of those cards that I think you're going to find extremely useful in multiple situations. As well too, because they give you so many copies of it, there's a good chance you'll have it in your hand when you can really find a great use for it. Moving on now to the 3 drops, we have 4 copies of Chandra's Spitfire. For 2 and a red, you get a 1/3 elemental with flying. Whenever an opponent is dealt non-combat damage, Chandra's Spitfire gets +3/+0 until the end of turn. Now, I've played against this card in sealed events in Magic Arena, and I have to tell you, it is deceptively good. A 1/3 flyer for 3 is okay. However, the extra ability to give itself +3/+0 whenever an opponent is dealt non-combat damage is amazing. First of all, your opponent is going to need a flyer just to block it. They're going to need a 3 power flyer to kill it, and if they don't have any of that or any sort of removal, this thing can swing in for a lot of extra damage in the last second. For example, if you swing in with this and the Scorch Spitter, so you swing in and immediately your opponent takes 1 point of damage. That's going to trigger this ability and make it a 4/3. Let's say you also have a shock in hand. Before damage goes through, you shock your opponent directly to the face. They've now taken 3 points of non-combat damage in 2 instances of it, which means this is now a 7/3 swinging in, and you could do that on turn 4. So yes, even though this card may not seem like it, it can be brutal to play against if your opponent doesn't have anything to block it. Now, since the only 4-drop and 5-drop creatures in this deck were both the exclusive cards, which we talked about before, we're now going to jump to a 6-drop spot with a rare card, Shivan Dragon. For 4 and 2 red, you get a 5/5 flyer. With pay 1 red, it gets +1/+0 until the end of turn. So Shivan Dragon is one of those classic cards that have been around forever. It's not exactly the most flashy dragon out there, but it still does the job it's meant to do, which is swing in over your opponent's blockers and beat their face in. First of all, the 5/5 flying body is tough for an opponent to deal with. Even if they have flying blockers, chances are they're either going to have to double block or use one of their creatures as a chump blocker, because not a lot can go toe-to-toe with a 5/5 flyer. As well too, if this ever does get through for unblocked combat damage, you can then really punish your opponent, because the pump ability only costs 1 red mana to give it +1/+0 each time. And since this creature costs 6 just to get on the battlefield, that means you will have most likely at least 6 mana available to you. So when it does swing in, it has the potential of being an 11/5 heading your opponent's way to crush their face. Now granted, you only do get 1 copy of this in the deck, but if you do find it at the right time, this will be a game changer. And speaking of game-changing dragons, let's move on to the final creature in this deck. Now it's a costly one to get out there. It costs 4 and 3 red, but if you can cast that, you'll get Drakaseth, Maw of Flames on your side. This 7/7 legendary dragon creature has, of course, flying, but it also has, whenever it attacks, it deals 4 damage to any target and 3 damage to each of up to 2 other targets. Now, like with the Scorch Spitter, all it has to do to trigger those abilities is simply attack. It doesn't have to connect with combat damage. It just has to be able to move to combat and swing in. And if that happens, the board is going to change. First of all, you get to do 4 damage to any target. Now, that can be your opponent's face if you want it, or it can be one of the creatures which would have been able to block. It can then do 3 damage to up to 2 other targets. So when this thing simply turns sideways to attack, you have the ability, even if you're not going to do any extra damage to your opponent, to remove up to 3 creatures your opponent already has on the board, which could have been blockers, off of the board and clear the way for this to swing in for 7 points of combat damage. Now, like with the Shivan Dragon, there is only 1 copy of this in the deck, but if you are able to get it on the board and swing in with it even once, your opponent is in for a horrible round of combat. Honestly, this is one of those cards that when they hit the board, if there's not an answer for it immediately, chances are your opponent is not going to live very long. Okay, so now that we've ended on a high note when it comes to the creatures, let's move on now to the non-creature spells in this deck. All of the non-creature spells in this deck have some form of burn, except for this very first one, Infuriate. You get 2 copies of this 1-drop. For 1 red, it's an instant. Target creatures get +3/+0 until the end of turn. So what you have here is just a nice, simple, instant speed pump spell, which can really turn the tables on your opponent when it comes to either attacks or even defending. Now, you do only get 2 copies of it, so you may want to hold on to it till you really need it, but whenever you cast it, I'm sure it's going to be a nice little surprise for your opponent. Moving on now to another 1-drop instant speed card. For 1 red, we have the classic Shock. Shock deals 2 damage to any target. Not really much to say here, it's just a nice little bit of versatile burn at instant speed, super cheap, deals damage to your opponent, their creatures, or a planeswalker, whatever you want. Keep in mind too, when it comes to shock in this deck, because there are so many creatures that benefit from you doing damage to your opponent, you could just decide to spend this and cast it directly to your opponent's face, and you'll get added benefit across your board. And they do put 4 copies of this in your deck, so chances are you're going to have it loaded, ready to go when you really need it. Moving now from 1-drops to 4-drops, we're getting to the final non-creature, non-land card in this deck, and that is Chandra's Outrage. For 2 and 2 red, you get an instant card, which is deal 4 damage to target creature and 2 damage to that creature's controller. So 4 damage to a creature, first of all, is usually enough to wipe a large variety of them off the board. Plus, you get the added benefit of doing 2 damage to your opponent, which once again will pump up a lot of the creatures in this deck. And the biggest thing is, this gets cast at instant speed. So even though it's not the cheapest burn spell out there, it's still an instant speed burn spell that can be cast at pretty much any time to turn the tables on your opponent. And of course, poke them in the eye while you're doing it. So there you go, folks. That is every single non-land card in the deck, which really just leaves the lands to talk about. But since this is a mono red deck, all there is mountains. 25 mountains. Alrighty, so that pretty much just leaves my final thoughts on the deck. But before I get to that, there's one last order of business we need to deal with, and that's opening up that booster pack of Core Set 2020 and showing you guys what's inside. Oh, and one last thing, I do open the packs in a different room using a different microphone than I use right now, so it is going to sound a little bit different, but trust me, it's still me, I promise. Alrighty, so because this is only a single pack, I'm going to read off each of the cards, not fully, but I'm going to read off all the cards, and I'm going to fully read off the rare card in the end. So we've got this, no table required for MTG Arena. We have Steadfast Sentry, Act of Treason. I love drafting this card. Audacious Thief. This card has been absolutely crazy in the small amount of limited play I've been able to do with it. This is a great card. I think this is a very, very great card. We got Daybreak Chaplain, Lavakin Brawler, Unsummon, Netcaster Spider, Goblin Smuggler, Natural End, Shock, classic card, classic bit of red burn. Our first uncommon is Ancestral Blade. It's a nice little card as well too. I've enjoyed drafting this or playing with it in Sealed so far. Hardcover. Our final uncommon is Overgrowth Elemental, and our rare card is Glint Horn Buccaneer. For 1 and 2 red, you get a 2/4 Minotaur Pirate. It's got haste, and whenever you discard a card, Glint Horn Buccaneer deals 1 damage to each opponent. Pay 1 and 1 red, discard a card, draw a card. Activate this ability only if Glint Horn Buccaneer is attacking. That's an interesting sort of take on that type of ability, sort of like the Mana Sink ability. It can only do it when it is attacking. So this is the first rare in the very first pack of M20 that I've ever opened. So, I mean, it's not, a huge bomb, but it's definitely an interesting card. We get a Swamp, and we have a Wolf token. As well, too, if you guys are interested in tokens, we do have a Token of the Month club that we do through Brainpulp TV. Now, we create our own tokens. These are exclusive to Brainpulp TV. Each and every month, there's a new token, and we'll mail between 1 to 10 right to your door. My friend, Lara D'Souza, and myself do the artwork. He does the character design and the line art. I do the colors over top of it. And we produce, new tokens every month. So you can sign up. There is going to be a link that's going to take you to a video explaining more or the site itself. It's done through Patreon. Just it's easier that way for us to do it. And there's also going to be a link in the description below. Anyway, that is the end of this little Token of the Month Club plug and the end of this pack of Core Set 2020. And now it's time for my final thoughts on the deck. I want to start off by saying that unlike with some of the Planeswalker deck overview videos I've done in the past where I had to assess the deck strictly based on their deck list, this time around I've actually been able to play several of these decks against one another while shooting our Planeswalker deck showdown videos prior to recording this one. Anyway, now that I played around with it a bit, I honestly like it a lot more than I did when I first saw the list online. The deck as a whole has great synergy. The number of options you have to constantly chip away at your opponent with direct damage allows cards like Chandra's Spitfire to do a lot of heavy lifting in this deck. In fact, I'll go so far as to say that Chandra's Spitfire is probably one of the MVPs of this deck. Granted, it's not as flashy as some of your dragons, but it functions very much the same way that Crackling Drake does in the Izzet Tempo decks, or the Arcane Tempo decks if you're familiar with the Challenger decks. It's a small creature which, on the surface, may not seem like much, but it will end up doing a large amount of damage to your opponent over time. One of the other things I really like about the overall design of this deck is that they've added so many nice little mana sinks to it. Normally, a creature that's a 2/2, for example, that shows up later in the game isn't going to be much use to you. But in this deck, your mana is constantly working for you as long as you have pretty much any creature on the board other than the ones that react to direct damage to your opponent. And I'm not just talking about like the Pyroclast Elemental, which you can just pump mana into constantly to keep pinging away at your opponent. Even something like the Ember Hauler, which it's a one and done mana thing. It's going to do an extra 2 points of damage, but at least it does something with the excess mana you're going to have later in the game. The Pack Mastiff, you get a couple of those out, pump them up a few times, you're forcing your opponent into either most likely unfavorable blocks or taking a boatload of damage. So many times with Planeswalker decks in the past, they fill them with so many vanilla creatures that once they hit the board, they're not doing anything. And this is such a refreshing change of pace. Now, of course, the deck does have its flaws, one of which I mentioned earlier, which is the lack of card draw that can cause you to run out of gas early and leave you dead in the water mid to late game. Also, in general, Planeswalker decks just don't have the power level to compete with other established constructed decks in Standard, so you won't really be able to grab this, head off to your local Friday Night Magic, and try to take the world by storm. That said, you could do some fun upgrades with this deck to give it a bit more bite. The first idea that springs to mind is taking a page out of Mono Red Aggro's book, or Lightning Aggro's book, if you're familiar with the Challenger decks. You cut out a large part of your mid-range cards, and instead add in cards that are both cheaper to cast and hit the ground running. So things like Fanatical Firebrands would work especially well with your Spitfires. Even Runaway Steamkins could be a great fit and would possibly allow you to keep a couple of your bigger, more costly dragons in the deck as well too. Also, a finishing burn spell like Banefire could help you win a few games that might be going a bit longer than you would have liked. Now there is another idea I could suggest. It has less battle testing than Mono Red Aggro, but it could still be a lot of fun. You could convert this to an elemental tribal deck. After all, there are already more than a few elementals in this deck, some of which you'll only be able to find in this deck. Plus, there are more than a few red cards from M20 that play well with other elementals like Thunderkin Awakener, Scampering Scorcher, Lavakin Brawler, and even Chandra's Embercat. Then, when you're done filling up your deck with a few extra elementals, head on down to the artifact section, look up Icon of Ancestry, add 2 or 3 of those to your deck. You are now well on your way to going tribal. However, let's say you don't want to really change much in the deck, but you do want to fix that pesky lack of card draw problem. Probably one of the best options in red right now is still Experimental Frenzy. Sure, it's not direct card draw, but it's such a great card when it comes to helping mono red decks out with card advantage. Or if you want to stick with just the new M20 cards, another one you could try is the same one I pulled as my rare in that pack I opened up a few minutes ago, Glinthorn Buccaneer. After all, it's got a low mana cost, it has haste, a decent sized butt with that 2/4 body, which makes both a good attacker or early game blocker, but most importantly, it's extra card draw that also does direct damage to your opponent, which this deck thrives on. Oh, and one more suggestion. If you don't mind spending 5 or 6 times what this entire deck costs, a playset of Chandra Awakened Inferno wouldn't be a bad thing to slip in there either. However, I'm guessing the more budget conscious of you out there might draw the line when it comes to that card. Okay, but setting rather costly upgrade suggestions aside, to sum things up with this deck, I think when stacked up against not just the other core set 2020 decks, but a lot of the Planeswalker decks in the past, Chandra Flame's Fury deck definitely has some strong legs under it, even if you play it right out of the box. So those are pretty much all of my thoughts. What I want to know is what your thoughts are on this deck. Please feel free to drop me a comment in the comment section. Give me your thoughts, questions. Hell, just say hi and let me know how your experience with M20 has been so far. I always love hearing from you folks. However, that is it for this video. So thank you all so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. And I appreciate all the support. So many of you keep showing the channel month in, month out with every video that does get released. And a special shout out to everyone who checked out the early access stream I did a week or so ago, who dropped by to say hi. Streaming is definitely something I'm going to be doing more regularly come August. And a big reason for that is how supportive so many of you have been, despite the fact that there was a few technical bumps along the way during that sort of initial test stream. I appreciate the fact that you guys stuck with it. Oh, and of course, keep an eye out for the upcoming episodes of the Mana Cave, where I will be battling it out with this deck, as well as the other Core Set 2020 Planeswalker decks, against my friends in some live Paper Magic action. Alrighty, that is it for me. Take care, everyone. Have a wonderful day, night, morning, evening, whatever it is, wherever you are. May all your pulls be mythics, and I'll see you all again very soon.